And I already knew that the economic models we were looking at carried their own values, and that our values were different, and that culture was our strength, not our weakness. Because this was back in the days where everybody knew Indians couldn't do business because we shared too much and we cooperated. It seemed to me like those were good things, and that businesses could be successful by sharing and cooperating. It's not that Indian people can't do business. It's they don't value profit over community. They don't value profit over life. So we were never going to succeed by their metrics, because a tree only has value once it's cut down and it's board feet on the market. And so if you care about trees, you can't succeed in that economy. And this was becoming more and more apparent. So I really wanted to keep us, by listening, let our indigenous communities form their own solutions, because I just believed they would. The more First Nations began understanding and listening better and really looking at down the road, we'll never have the success they're looking for. So we basically would get ahead of it. We designed our own valuation techniques so that we could actually assign value and assess success based on the change in the assets. Like increasing control of assets, increasing assets, using assets to leverage, creating assets. We began to track our own success based on asset development. And it allowed us to bring the cultural piece in a way that we couldn't before. Indigenous people own 5% of this country's land base. Globally, Indigenous people own 28% of the Earth's land surface. The amount of resources, and 80% of the biodiversity is on our land. We should be the richest people around by economic law. So what is this if it's not the fact that our assets are taken, converted into cash for them, or the benefit of the asset is derived and directed to them? We might still own the Colorado River, but they've diverted the water. You know, so we were looking at every point how our assets were used to make them wealthy. So we began looking at this asset piece as a very important strategy, but also the vehicle for allow us to culturally mold how we wanted to develop. Because we could track our assets and change in assets, and that's what First Nations then really began doing systematically. The whole economic system doesn't work for Indigenous people. When you see the world holistically and you see your job as living in balance and harmony, these are fundamental design principles of an Indigenous economy versus the kind of competition and maximum yield principles that you're looking at that are structured into the existing. And so in Western economy, what's rewarded is the accumulation. The system is designed to reward accumulation, so if you already have it, you get more. Versus seeing a system designed for creative development, where you're looking at both the unlimited kinds of creative ideas that can come out of the entrepreneurship, the natural entrepreneurship of people in their environment to solve their own problems is the basis of entrepreneurism. It was unmistakable the brilliance we had in our communities, and unmistakable how ignored it was. Yeah. So for me, it was a matter of, quite simply, I wanted to go and I wanted to listen to our people in different communities, different Indian people, listen to the tribal stories, listen to the community story and experience. And in that kind of close listening, solutions actually emerged. It wasn't magic, it was just natural, respectful listening and an openness to the brilliance. Most of the federal programs were just almost guaranteed failures. They were handed out to Indian country in a way that was very piecemeal, that it was somebody else's idea in DC, and they thought it was good for us to try it out there in the middle of Montana, Wyoming, or Arizona, with no understanding of our communities or even the surrounding communities' economy for that matter. And it was time and time again, you could drive across Indian country and you'd see these monuments to failure, but it was like they never were our failure. We never wanted these things in the first place, and yet we had to live with their failure on our legacy. I mean, it's Einstein's old saying that the thought patterns that created the problem are not the thoughts that are going to solve it. And so here was a treasure trove of diversity in looking at this most fundamental problem of human nature, which is how do you have a livelihood and sustain yourself within a balance and harmony of life. They want sustainability. The answers are right in our communities. And the fascinating thing about our economies, the goal was to meet the widest number of needs for the highest number of people, not accumulation. And so distribution vehicles were extremely sophisticated in that economy versus taxes in ours. We've got one redistribution vehicle in this economy. There was numerous ones. I mean, they had walkabouts when you were a baby. You went out and you had something in your purse and you just gave it to people. You already learned to share from the get-go. Yes. And that distribution of wealth was in every aspect of the culture.
So wealth was to give.
And that's how you sustain. Mm-hmm. It's self-fulfilling. If you truly believe there were a bunch of individuals with insatiable appetites and we're going to run out, scarcity of resources, you will hoard. You will hoard, 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 and this is what we have. We have a few people hoarding everything and we're running out. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, I worked with the Coalition of Indian Schools, and then I had this idea that it seemed like one of the problems where we were always taking federal monies to do stuff we didn't even want to do, and therefore when it failed, we got blamed for it, yet it was never going to work. I mean, you don't put marinas into South Dakota, and if that's what they're funding that year, that's the only thing you can get. And so it was almost like I didn't know better, but I did go test it. I took a year and went up to North Dakota and wanted to sort of check out. I had put together this sort of modeling where we were going to look for untapped resources to mobilize. We were going to look at embedding our economy within the surrounding economy and get cash flowing into rather than out of all the time. So and diversify the income base. So there were key principles that I was using to begin with, and I went up to United Tribes Technical Education Center in North Dakota in Bismarck. And so I got there and I looked at, UTEC was pretty dependent on federal funds at the time, mostly from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and I began looking at different ways we could generate revenue. So we took our, actually we took the powwow. Every year they had this spectacular powwow in North Dakota, and people from Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, and even further came to the powwow. Well, I thought, well, wait a minute, let's see if we could make some money off the powwow. And I went to the North Dakota State Tourism Department, and they matched us $4 to every $1 for marketing the powwow. So then we thought, well, what do we need? And the people come and they say, well, we bring our kids. We don't have any activities for the kids. So we came up with an activity book, like you connect the dots and you got moccasins, or you followed a maze through a star quilt, and all these little activities. But the local businesses had to sponsor them. So like we put together this activity book, and by the time it was done, we'd made maybe like $12,000 off of it. Now, pay attention to this. This is the first time we're actually generating non-federal dollars and earning money. Then we boosted up the entrance fee for non-powwow participants. So in other words, all the non-Indian people. And we also set it up so we went through the parking areas and the campsites, and we counted all the out-of-state plates. And we became North Dakota's only tourist destination attraction. Nobody came to North Dakota to be there, right? So they would go through to Yellowstone, or they went down to Black Hills, but nobody came to North Dakota except for the UTEC powwow. And so by the time it was all over, I don't remember the exact amount, but I think we came in around high 70,000, which was significant. And back in those days, that's very significant. Yes. And so we began really looking at these principles and writing up the results. And I thought, there's something here. There's potential to earn revenue in a whole lot of our operations. And we needed to break our dependency off this federal dollars. Now, believe me, treaty rights demand the obligation that has been committed in those treaty rights is that we are obligated to have federal funds brought to us by this government for the treaties and for the land and the historic understandings of our relationship with the federal government. So that money was due us. It wasn't that that was the fault. The fault was it was the only resources we had. And we needed the independence, and we needed to achieve sovereignty. We have to have financial independence too. We also began doing some just basic economic 101 kinds of technical studies. We did a flow of funds studies, and we saw that less than 7 cents on the dollar actually stayed in Pine Ridge, with 93 cents on the dollar going to the border town economy. And so we looked at that. We also looked at banks in the loan to deposit ratio to see how much of the community's deposits were on hand at the bank and how much did they actually lend back, which became one of the factors in the Community Reinvestment Act, was this what they called upstreaming the capital, so that all these banks, the headquarters might be in Minnesota, so all the banks suck the money out of those states and take it to their headquarters. A reservation is the actual microscopic version of all of how extractive and exploitative the economic system is that we operate under. They were doing a conference on economic development, and he'd asked us to present. And so we were presenting how much money did not stay, how much money left the reservation. We were presenting the money on what the bank itself actually had built a whole branch based on the tribe's deposits and accounts, and yet was making no loans back. So that really sparked at that moment, in that economic development tribal college conference, they began talking about some kind of lending mechanism. They wanted to do a lending program so they could capture their own economy and begin holding some of that economy and have the turnover, get at least a one-time turnover of the dollar on the reservation, which really and truly is the story behind the Lakota Fund. The real foundation for the Lakota Fund started at that workshop with the Lakota people and them looking at the information and coming up with the solution. We didn't have the name microlending. Right. We didn't even know what kind of loan fund we were actually going to do, but I heard that loud and clear. So by looking at ourselves and looking at a total undying belief that culture was our strength, not our problem, I wanted to open up and raise money that we could use in a way that allowed us to move in any direction that the community was working at, in thinking about and wanting to develop. The Lakota Fund really for a long time was the first, but for a long time it was the only successful economic development Pine Ridge had ever experienced. There another Indian man that was getting his master's degree in economic development, and I started talking to him, and he created this informal sector study, and he went out and he basically the question was, what do you do to make money? And he began looking at 83% of the households earned about 87% of their income from these informal activities. They made coffins for the cemetery, they welded crosses for the cemetery, they mended fences, they did hair, they babysat, they sold lunches to the Indian Health Service or the Bureau of Indian Affairs people. There was 118 vibrant activities that were being done every day to make money. And I was like, that's it. Yeah. That's what we want to lend to. This is it. Right. And it was just all there, all of it in front of us, all this creativity, entrepreneurship. That sort of really, it was like all of a sudden, boom, we had it. We had the pipeline. We knew our borrowers. And so we began lending. And then like everything, the stories, unfold. We had to retweak the collateral, but it was all very exciting. We had star quilts, horse saddles, you name it, the collateral was collateral. We had a woman that made sandwiches for Indian Health, and she basically catered the lunches down there. Well, she had about 6 kids that were living with her, single mom, and she was getting maybe $625 a month to live off of. So we started helping her expand her business through a loan. She came in and got one of the first early loans, and she increased over $200 a month through her business. $200 is a significant amount when you're living off of $625. Yeah. So we started seeing really immediate results that were dramatic for the scale of our economy and what the usual size Was, and in fact, that was the point. Our businesses were thriving at a small size that was being totally ignored by conventional financing. And we weren't the only ones. It ended up the whole microenterprise and community development loan fund movement took off across the country.
Yes,
it had always been considered conventionally, or conventional banking, let me put it that way, conventional banking, thinking that poor people were not creditworthy. And we were absolutely proving that poor people were creditworthy. And one of the things about the Lakota Fund that I used to say a lot was that it was our biggest success and it was our biggest failure. And people would ask, what do you mean failure? And my point in the story was, if you look at the beginning and how it evolved, it was really driven by indigenous leadership, indigenous conversation, dialogue, and problem solving. And once it really took off the ground, all of a sudden it became a copycat to the Grameen Bank. And it became this, oh, we did what Dr. Eunice did, you're doing the Grameen Bank. And it was both an answer of yes and no, because the no was very important. People missed the fact this was indigenous problem solving that created the Lakota Fund before we'd even heard about the Grameen Bank. And it was that way of thinking that I wanted to continue to harness and bring into contemporary application and also to scale. So as the Lakota Fund was up and making its loans, I was approached by a Wayne Silby and a John Guffey, and they were the founders of the Calvert Social Investment Fund. And this is about mid-90s, and they had heard about the Lakota Fund, and they were looking under their mutual fund umbrella at some way to work with poor people, was their idea. And boom, I went on the board, not knowing exactly how a mutual fund worked, but having an incredible lawyer who was our counsel, an independent counsel who worked with me. And one of the things I would talk about at the first board meeting was poor people being creditworthy. And they had said that they thought they could take, and they had a couple examples, because one of the board members was very keen on looking at this issue, and the one that had kept it alive. And he had taken a small couple $100,000, which is peanuts in the mutual fund portfolios, and put them into some of the low housing loan funds up in the Northwest. And I was like, we could create an intermediary or a sort of think tank around democratizing the financial systems. And one of the things that they talked about was doing something like the Lakota Fund on a national scale, only getting the investors into it. So we weren't real clear about it, but I ended up, again, writing up the business plan for looking at taking 1% of our portfolio and investing it directly into the community development financial institutions. Well, we had to clear SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission, which was a riot, explaining that our investment statement, some of the purpose of our investments were society well-being, and the Securities Exchange Commission was like, what is this societal well-being? You know, how do you have societal well-being? And we'd have to explain this stuff. And then they were, and now we were doing this investment into low-income loan funds, and we're saying poor people are creditworthy. The SEC was just wanting to run when they saw us coming up there. So we worked through the hoops. We had to have the shareholders approve this type of investment so we could put it on our proxy statement. We had a shareholder meeting, and it was fascinating. I got up and I presented some stories from the Lakota Fund, and I talked about the fact that the private sector had no vehicle for investing in these kinds of loan funds that worked with communities. And we wanted to experiment with our shareholders, and could we use 1% of our portfolio for this kind of high social impact investing? And I used the term high social impact. And one of the ladies grabbed the microphone and she said, I want to do 5%. And then another lady said, we could go more than that. And I'm standing there. Now remember, I'm not quite sure how we're going to do this yet. And I'm kind of thinking, for the first time in my life, I'm going to be more moderate and not as radical. And I'm not quite sure how to get there. But then Wayne Silby, the chairman, got up with me, and we both ended up saying, let's try 1%. Just like that, voted unanimously through. And so there, overnight, we had several hundreds of millions of dollars. And that was such an eye-opener to realize that we created this high social impact investment within our mutual fund. Well, then as it grew and we got more sophisticated and the due diligence on these investments was extensive, And I happened to be the only one that could do it at the time, so I was doing these things and getting them into the pipeline. Then we decided to move it over to the foundation, the Calvert, which is now called Capital Strategies. Calvert Capital Strategies is a separate foundation, but it allowed us more flexibility to work on an asset class in the market. This was the only private sector vehicle for individual investors to invest in these kinds of community financial institutions. And we were able to get FDIC status of it insured, and it became a class of its own. It's community notes. So these principles of wide distribution of wealth, multi-income generating, scale, all from an indigenous economy were applied in the design of the community notes that became the major investment vehicle for all the community development financial institutions. And when you really thought about it, again, bringing full circle, I was just all the more convinced that culture was our strength and that the entrepreneurism would take us to where we needed to be. Exactly. And actually come up with solutions for everybody. I was seeing a profound application and brilliance behind the systems design that became sort of the rest of my body of work, was looking at harnessing traditional knowledge for contemporary application. Like I said, my early work was almost like segregation. It was like, we just want this for tribal. And to understand and come to a place where it's a world force, and that it needs to be brought. Indigenous people need to assume their rightful place as leaders in this world.
And you're right, it is happening now.
And it has a generative quality to it, Jan. There's something, the reciprocity and the understanding beyond transactions. There's relationships in this work. And I think the relationships are the genuine sort of energy flow that you need. It's not to say it's smooth, it's not to say it's a barrel of laughs every minute, but it is to say how you get through the really dark times. And some of this is incredibly hard work, incredibly hard work.